When we hear of black-eyed children, they're probably saying, what's that? Give us a little overview.
Well, the people who encounter them are still saying, what's that? Essentially, a short description. These are children who are showing up at people's homes, places of business. They're approaching cars and parking lots. They're generally described as being somewhere between 10 years old and the early teens. They're described as having very pale skin, monotone voices, and, of course, completely solid black eyes, hence the term that we now commonly associate with them, black-eyed children, or BEKs, black-eyed kids. What happens typically in these encounters is that these children will approach a person and they will ask for something. They'll knock on someone's door and ask to come in out of the rain or come in for a drink of water. Often the phrases are very odd. We just thought we'd stop in for a while. And these are children that, the resident has never seen before in their life.
Yeah, they're not like neighborhood kids, right?
No, not at all. Not at all. Typically, when they approach, they are sort of holding their heads down, so they're not making direct eye contact initially. And people describe a growing sense of concern initially. Obviously, it's a child, so it sort of takes people off guard. We're sort of hardwired to help children if they're asking for something.
Are there ever any black-eyed parents with them?
It's interesting you ask that, George. There are a couple of cases that have come to light where adults are appearing with these children. And actually, something I thought we'd talk about a little bit tonight is the fact that there are a growing number of accounts now of black-eyed adults showing up and approaching people, just completely without the children. Now, that's sort of interesting because really the first significant modern case of these black-eyed children goes back to 1996 with a gentleman named Brian Bethel. It's probably the most famous encounter at this point. And his encounter occurred in Texas in 96, and he had a situation where these two kids approached him in a parking lot. And, he was sitting in his car writing a check, and they approached his car window and started asking him for a ride. They said they wanted to see a movie, and he had the sense of mind to look up at the marquee and realize that the movie was, pretty far into the last showing, and it didn't make any sense what these kids were asking. And he had this sense of concern that accelerated. He started feeling short of breath. He was very nervous, and suddenly these kids make eye contact, and he realizes that they've got solid black eyes, no whites at all. And at that point, the fear just sort of spikes. He throws the car in reverse, and he gets, out of the parking lot as quick as he can. Interesting enough, as he's pulling out of the parking lot, he looks in the rearview mirror, and these kids have vanished. And that's very typical in these encounters. People will slam the door on these children when they reach that peak of fear, and they just want to get away from them. They'll go over and look out the window, and these kids have vanished. They're nowhere to be seen.
David, what happens if you let them into your house or if you let them into the car?
There's one really significant case that is covered in my book wherein a black-eyed child was in for lack of a better word, a victim's car. And that particular incident, I don't remember if we've spoken about it before or not, but essentially what happened was a woman had her 10-year-old child in the back seat of her car, live in a small town. She's on her way home. She stops by the convenience store, jumps out, leaving her child in the car, goes in to grab her loaf of bread or milk or whatever, comes back out, and this really will creep you out, George. You can imagine
just what I need tonight.
We've all been there sort of on autopilot. She jumps back in the car, tossing the groceries in the passenger seat, turns over the engine, and as she does, she's automatically looking in the rearview mirror to check on her child. And when she does that, staring back at her in the rearview mirror is a little boy with solid black eyes, sitting directly beside her son. Now, that's sort of odd to begin with. He's sitting in the middle of the, back seat as opposed to on the passenger side in the back seat, as a normal person would probably do. So he's making physical contact with this young boy. her fear spikes immediately. She really she goes from, complete calm to instant fear in a matter of seconds, jumps out of the vehicle, yanks open the back door and pulls her son out and runs back in the convenience store. Now she gets inside and she's sort of, stuttering and stammering, and the clerk has rushed around knowing something's wrong, and, all she can get out is that there's somebody in her car. The clerk rushes out. There's the vehicle, both doors standing open, no one around. No sign of a child, no sign of anyone else. It's a very open parking lot. This child would have had to have been the flash to get away, and out of sight from this situation. So the aftermath of this encounter was that this woman was so frightened she wouldn't admit to the clerk what had happened. She didn't know what to say, and all she wanted to do was call her husband and have him come up to the store. They didn't live very far away. Now, she didn't explain what had happened to her husband over the telephone, just that she needed him to come up there, and she would explain it all when they got home. So he comes up to the store. They switch vehicles because she doesn't even want to get back in her vehicle. He drives her vehicle back to the house.
Yeah. On
the way home, he's in a wreck and totals the car. So he ends up in the hospital. Fortunately, he had, what turned out to be fairly minor injuries. They kept him for observation for possible concussion and so forth. He has no recollection of what happened, except that the last thing he can remember was smelling a foul odor in the vehicle. Now, the wife didn't relate this aspect. She didn't remember a smell, but he remembered something. The people at the hospital concluded, it must have been some kind of a gas leak or something that caused you to pass out. Now, the further disturbing aspect to this encounter was that here we have this 10-year-old boy who had let this black-eyed child in the vehicle, and when the mother finally talks to him and she says, she's trying not to alarm the child, who doesn't really get what's going on, what's the problem here. She talks to her son and she said, do you know that boy from school? And the response was, no, Mommy, I don't know him. And
they just
pressed
pop
him
up
more for, why did he get in the car? The son says, well, I thought we could go to my house and play.
Oh, great.
So, here's this innocent child, just seeing a potential playmate.
Sure.
Lets this black-eyed kid in the vehicle, has essentially physical contact with him. The disturbing aspect, George, is that this 10-year-old boy became ill. They took him to the doctors, of course, and when they did, the doctors began to attempt to diagnose what was wrong with this child.
And I bet they had no idea.
Well, the issue was the symptoms kept changing. They thought at one point this child had the measles because he broke out in a rash. Okay, we've got it figured out. That's what it is. What appears to be measles goes away. They thought he had a virus. They thought he had appendicitis. They're completely puzzled because every time they think they figure something out, his symptoms change. The parents, eventually obviously just get very frustrated and, they're still frightened for their child. And they end up taking the child home and trying to decide what to do. And over the course of how all this played out, they ended up just sort of calling on friends and family and having prayer visuals for this child and sort of going back to a more spiritual lifestyle, which they had not had before. They were not, strongly religious people when all this happened.
Did it work for them?
It did.
David, these children, these black-eyed children, where do you think they're coming from?
Oh, wow, that's a big question. My personal theory is I think these are some type of interdimensional creatures, for lack of a better word. I don't think they're children at all. I think they're something that is able to assume the form of a child in order to catch people off guard. And, we're starting to see some interesting things in science now. Science has been talking about other dimensions and parallel universes and so forth. quite a bit the last few years. It used to be science fiction, and now quantum theorists are talking about, no, we know there are other dimensions of existence, and we're just not sure how to get to them. But that doesn't mean that whatever's there doesn't know how to get here. When you go back to old tribal and cultural lore from around the world, you find very similar things. People that ancient peoples that talk about these beings that used to live here, and at some point they left, whether they left through a shimmering doorway or a hole in the sky, or perhaps in a craft. And I think what they were trying to interpret was that they were seeing something that went into another level, another dimensional existence. And I really think that that's what we're seeing at this point. A lot of portal areas around the world, and people in the paranormal have been talking about this for years, people like John Keel, these window areas where a lot of strange things happen in a collected space, and that those are possibly points of entry for these things. Slender Man started out essentially as an internet meme. It was created by all evidence on a forum called Something Awful, and the goal was to essentially fabricate some type of paranormal topic that could be portrayed as genuine and made to go viral on the internet. And initially, in the beginning stages of this contest, there were a lot of different people photoshopping cryptids and UFOs and so forth. And this guy came up with a very sort of subtle idea of this character that eventually became called Slender Man. And it was depicted as a tall, thin figure in black that sort of lurked in the background. He was loosely associated with school fires and disappearances of children and so forth. And what happened was the whole thread was taken over by the Slender Man topic, and other people started contributing, and they essentially built an entire mythology around this thing. Now, there are some arguments that they essentially based this on some older lore from different places around the world. There's a figure in Europe called the Schwarzman, the Dark Man, and there's another one called the Tall Man. So essentially some similarities with those figures. But we may be looking at something even more disturbing when it comes down to it, and this is something I've been talking about for a few years now. It's the idea of a tulpa. And a tulpa essentially is something that is created through the powers of the human mind. This goes pretty far back to ancient Tibetan beliefs, and essentially this idea that through meditation and focus and concentrating a tremendous amount of energy, that something could be created into the physical. It would go through stages of first being something existing only in the individual's mind. Then it would start to appear as a ghostly form, an apparition. And if the process continued, then it eventually would be able to take on full physical form. Now, Slender Man may be something similar to that, in that we may be seeing something created by the collective consciousness. Because when they released this on the internet, there were, God knows how many people who believed this was a genuine phenomenon. And people started believing they were seeing or encountering the Slender Man. In fact, I know that your show, in fact, received some sort of panic calls at one point.
Sure.
People, claiming they had encounters with the Slender Man. So, we could be looking at a couple of different possibilities here. It could be a tulpa being created into existence through the collective consciousness and the massive amount of fear that people are projecting into this thing. Or it could be that what we're seeing is some other type of entity who's able to take the guise of the Slender Man in order to, play on people's fears of this thing.
Do you think it's possible that something can be manifested by the human mind if enough people participate in it? I mean, we've seen what has happened with intention experiments, where the collective consciousness affects things, maybe changes the weather, alters the direction of a tornado or something. Is it possible, and you were touching on this a little bit, can we manifest Slender Man?
I think that the human mind has abilities that we've barely touched on. And when you, again, going back to some older cultures, when you look at people like the ancient Tibetans and their ideas of what the human consciousness and mind are capable of, ultimately, yes, I absolutely think it's possible. When it comes to the whole Tulpa aspect, there are some pretty fascinating things that have experiments that have been done out there. You know, there's the famous Philip experiment, wherein a group of people decided that they wanted to essentially create a spirit. And what they did was they got together and they created an entire backstory for this figure. And they put in some things that were not quite historically accurate. They created a whole tragic personal story for him, and then they proceeded to attempt to contact him. Now, what occurred is a series of communications from this supposed spirit named Philip, and he started revealing information about people at the table that no one else knew. Now, you know, that gets pretty mind-bending when you start looking at, you know, where is this information coming from? Is this, again, people projecting their collective consciousness into transmitting the message, or have they created something or contacted something that is, you know, assuming that form and utilizing the information? You know, the experiments got to the point where they were doing things like levitating the table, causing it to move around, knocking sounds, a lot of typical spiritualist-oriented phenomena. But it's really amazing when you look at the results that they were getting based on essentially creating a spirit.
Tell me a little bit about your work with the Jinn, which is quite prevalent in the Middle East.
Oh boy, yeah, that's a deep rabbit hole.
Huh.
And interesting enough, you know, when I wrote the Black-Eyed Children book in 2012 is when it came out, there was a chapter in there on the Jinn. And in the aftermath of that book coming out, I had more people contact me about the Jinn than I did anything else in the book, George, even the Black-Eyed Children. I just had a huge outpouring of people asking questions and wanting more information about the Jinn. And I sort of danced around the subject for a while. It was something that I had some experience with back in the 90s and had always been very fascinated by them. And when I started digging more into it, it gets more and more disturbing the deeper you go into this thing. It's interesting because Rosemary Guiley, you know, I spoke with her last year about the fact that I had decided I would probably write a book on the Jinn, and she said, well, you know, one, I think you're the perfect person to write a book on them, but two, you know, I got to warn you, it's not something that is an easy thing to do. And as we know, you know, Rosemary has written extensively on the Jinn, and boy, she was not kidding.
No, you're right.
They do not like to be observed. They do not like to be looked at. And in my opinion, they're one of the most important things that we can be studying within the paranormal right now, simply because, for one thing, there's so much growing contact with the Middle East and with the Muslim world. And, you know, we've got Western troops who have been in the Middle East now since the first Gulf War, you know, rotating in and out. And these guys are coming home, and a lot of them are bringing things back with them. The Jinn are ancient at their core. This goes back to the very beginnings of Islam. And something I always tell people, you know, a couple of things. One is that in the West, we're sort of preconditioned to think this is a joke. Because you say Jinn, first of all, people often aren't sure what you're talking about, and you have to clarify, okay, in the West, it's often called a genie. And then you usually get a laugh. because if they're, closer to our generation, they're thinking of Barbara Eden and the crazy harem pants,
Exactly.
screwing up all of her magic.
Or Sinbad and the Seven Seas or something.
Right, right. Or they're thinking of, the Disney cartoon with the big blue, genie who grants wishes. And boy, you couldn't be further from the truth as to what these things actually are. They're very sinister. They have an agenda all their own. I believe, once again, we're talking about essentially other dimensional beings, because in the lore of the Jinn, it talks about them being banished. The original creation story within Islam is that God, or Allah, as they call him, created 3 sentient races. He created humans, he created angels, and he created Jinn. And when he ordered the angels and the Jinn to bow down to the superiority of men, the Jinn refused. And because of that, they were banished. Now, the Jinn are seen as being immensely powerful within, that world. They are, the powers that are attributed to them are vast. They're able to shift their shape. They can take on the form of another person. They can take on the voice of your dead grandmother. They can assume the form of animals. They can turn invisible. They can travel across the world in the blink of an eye. They have a vast range of powers, and they have immense anger towards humans because they feel like it was humanity that caused them to be banished. So,
will they hurt people?
They will. They are often. They're very insidious as they, the way they operate. A Sufi once described them to me as, essentially saying they were like a spider. They would spin a web and weave it around a person to lure them in more and more until it was just too late. And I tell you, George, I've spoken to people. I've spoken to returning servicemen who, they come back from the Middle East and they start experiencing very strange paranormal phenomena in their homes. Poltergeist-like phenomena, things flying across the room or off of shelves, or they'll typically, they'll start hearing voices, and they'll say, I started getting psychic information from, my father, who's been deceased for 20 years, but I know it's him, I know his voice, and he told me, to go here to get a better job and to do this and do that. And initially, this information is very empowering. It seems to help the person. But then it sort of takes a turn because they have woven the person into their web. And then it becomes all about control. And
whatever happened to the 3 wishes?
That legend actually comes from especially in the medieval period. In the West, what we had was a lot of people practicing magic, attempting to, quote, bind demons or summon demons to do their will. And in the East, what you find is a lot of magicians or sorcerers were attempting to summon Jinn and bind them to objects. And this is where the whole legend of the genie in the lamp likely comes from, because these magicians were calling Jinn in, binding them to, for instance, a ring, which they would in turn sell, to a wealthy person and say, here's a ring that, a powerful Jinn is trapped in, and it will do your bidding. So, it's very interesting, because what happens inevitably with a lot of these modern stories of these servicemen returning, I hear them say, well, there was this, necklace I bought in a market when I was in the Middle East, and I thought the guy was kidding. He said it had a powerful Jinn in it. Or they're bringing souvenirs back that they found in deserted locations and so forth. And this is a very serious thing. It's very serious, and it's difficult to get people to realize that we're not talking about the comical genies. We're talking about something that...
Are they almost like devils?
They sort of are. It's hard to equate them exactly with Western traditions, but they are close in some ways to the Western idea, the Catholic idea of demons. Now, they, as I said, they have a very strong agenda, and one of the things to remember, going back to group consciousness again, is that I always tell people, bear in mind, if you're a Muslim, by default, you believe in the existence of Jinn, because Islam says, if it's written in the Quran, then it has to be true. And if you don't believe that, then you're not a good Muslim. So, we've got millions and millions. In the United States alone, we have somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 to 5 million Muslims. So just in this country alone, 3 to 5 million people who, guess what, believe in the existence of the Jinn.
Yeah, that is incredible. David, I want to talk about some of your future projects when we come back, but would you give out your websites, please?
Oh, sure. The books are available at leprechaunpress.com, and the best way to follow my work is twocrowsparanormal.blogspot.com. You'll see stories. There's a link to my Facebook page and all that stuff on there. These cases are increasing dramatically over the last few years, and really the best way to sort of convey what this phenomenon is about is to sort of give you an atypical experience that people are having. Someone comes home from work, they're, sort of settling into their evening routine, and they hear a knock at the door. These children never use doorbells for some reason. It's always this long, persistent knock without a break at all. Just sort of annoys people from the get-go. They go to the door. When they open it, they'll find anywhere from 1 to 2, sometimes 3 children standing on their steps. Usually these kids are sort of standing with their heads looking down at the ground or their shoes, and they're often dressed in very drab clothing, hoodies and jeans. When the person opens the door, these children will issue a statement, something to the effect of, hey, we just want to come in for a bit. And what people always report with this is sort of 3 stages of the experience. When they open the door and see these children, they're automatically uneasy for some reason.
Yeah, they're creeped out, aren't they?
Yeah, there's just something, they know right away that something's not right. And as they try to dialogue with these kids and ask the children questions, all they get are these repeated phrases in a very monotone voice, over and over and over again, things like, just let us in, this won't take long. These children are trying to get an invitation into the person's home. And during the course of the encounter, the victim, for lack of a better word, becomes more and more uneasy, nervous, and at some point, these children will look up and make eye contact, and that's when the person realizes that they're looking at a child with solid black eyes. Now, let me be clear, this is not just a black or dark pupil. It's the entire sclera, the entire eye is solid black, much like the depictions of the alien grays that are so popular. At that point, it usually sort of pushes the person over the edge, and their flight instinct kicks in. They'll slam the door. They'll run away from these kids. All they can think about is just getting away from these children as quickly as they can.
These children, do they always come in pairs?
No, there are a good number of cases where there's only one child.
How tall are they, David? Is this the size of a kid?
Yes. They're just, I always ask, of course, a whole wide range of questions when I interview people who've had these encounters, and the age bracket that I hear most often is that these appear to be children between 10 and 13 years of age.
Other than the black eyes, do they look normal?
Yes and no. Here's some of the odd facts about these encounters. The children seem to have very pale skin. Some people describe it as pasty. Mm-hmm. Some people say that it looks unnatural. One of the curious things I've found is I always ask, did you notice any kind of blemish on this child's skin? Now, bear in mind, these are, preteens and teenage kids, supposedly. So we would expect some acne, some, a pimple here and there, freckles, something. But no one ever sees any kind of blemish on the skin of these children. It's always just a pale, pasty white skin. The eyes are solid black. The tone of voice people say that it's very cold, that it's very monotone. Some people report that it seems as if these children have memorized a set of phrases, and they just keep repeating them again and again and again. So these are some of the common things that we find occur in these encounters.
Now, do they have any pupils at all in the eyes, or are they just all black?
It's just solid black.
That's weird.
It's just very creepy.
Do the eyes look like, not necessarily in size, but I mean, do they look like the alien grays that so many people describe?
As far as the eyes themselves, that sort of glistening black, that's what people report in regards to these children. Now, the eyes are not oversized, however. In every other apparent physical aspect, these look like normal children, except for the pale skin. But the eyes, they're normal size, but they are that solid, glossy black that we often hear in accounts of the alien grays.
These creatures, are they happening, are they showing up all over the country or all over the planet?
George, it's worldwide at this point.
Worldwide.
It's worldwide. When I first started looking into this phenomena, naturally I was discovering a lot of accounts from the United States, and of course I started looking for any kind of cluster to see if it was focused on any particular region, or, always looking for patterns when investigating these type of topics. And initially I thought, okay, this is a U.S.-based phenomena. It seems to be focused around a couple of different areas in the States that had a large number of accounts. But the more I explored it and the more I started getting, contacted from people and collecting these accounts, I found out that, no, there are accounts from other countries, too. I have accounts from places as far apart as Canada, Australia, South Africa, the UK. They're showing up everywhere. And, George, these things are increasing at a dramatic rate because every day I get people contacting me with accounts. And I'm not the only investigator, who's collecting these things. Other people are sort of tracking this, and they're hearing different accounts than the ones that I receive.
David, do people actually let them in their houses?
That's extremely rare. There's one chapter in the book that explores an invitation that led to a black-eyed child entering. Now, we can get into that. It's a bit of a long story.
Go ahead.
But for the most part, no, the flight instinct kicks in because, as I said, people sort of go through three stages. They're initially uneasy. It quickly goes to being very nervous, and that quickly develops to outright fear. And, George, all I can think about is getting away from these kids.
On those kids that enter the house, what do they do?
It appears from the data that I have collected, the closer the proximity of these children, the more unfortunate the results. For instance, there are accounts of people who have touched one of these children or been touched by one of them, and the results are pretty nasty. People report illnesses, a whole string of bad luck, very disturbing things happening in their lives. There was a gentleman in New Orleans who had close contact with a pair of these children, and, almost immediately afterwards, his sister passed away. Now, we sort of take a step back from that, and we have to wonder, are these children creating these circumstances, or are they some kind of weird omen, similar to, for instance, the Mothman or other paranormal entities that seem to foreshadow unfortunate events?
So they may be just there foretelling some kind of tragedy.
They may be, or that may just be one aspect of these beings, whatever they are. I don't believe for a moment that they're actually children, obviously.
Might they be demons?
That's a popular theory. And in fact, the two most popular opinions that you'll hear about these kids is that they are either some kind of demonic entity or that they are alien hybrids.
Okay, that's a possibility. How do they end up leaving the house? Or if they don't come in, how did they end up leaving?
Well, they simply seem to vanish. You know, I have accounts of law enforcement officers who encounter these kids, turn their heads for just a few seconds to knock on a door. They turn back, and these children have vanished.
They're gone.
They're gone.
People didn't see them going down the sidewalk, nothing.
Nothing.
I'm told that they have some kind of odor to them.
In a portion of the cases, they do. Probably in the accounts that I've collected, maybe somewhere between 20 and 30% of the cases this is reported. It's reported as being the most foul odor that you could ever imagine. You know, people report it as being something akin to sulfur, which we know is often associated with demonic activity. People report it as being, the smell of something rotting, of decay. And there are some strange things that occur with that. You know, there are people who have encountered these kids, been in close proximity, and found that the odor has permeated their clothing after they've encountered these kids, and they have an extremely difficult time getting that smell out.
Could they be coming back from the dead?
You know, we get into some almost mythological territory when we start talking about that. You know, when I lecture about this, I do present a section that talks about vampires. And, you know, sometimes that'll get a chuckle from people because we all know that there aren't really vampires running around sucking people's blood.
Are they upset when they don't get their own way?
Actually, they do not exhibit anything that would say that. It's very curious to me, George, that it seems as if the whole goal of these encounters is to create this high level of fear in the victim. I think, in fact, that these children are getting what they're setting out to achieve, and that's creating this spike of fear, because in almost all of the encounters, once the person reaches that flight mode and they're, terrified, these kids vanish. It's almost as if mission accomplished. And, that sort of implies to me that these beings, whatever they are feeding off of that emotional energy.
Now, has anybody been physically hurt? Directly? Not
directly by the children, no. There hasn't been any kind of assault. These children are very, it's strange because, they actually hardly move around at all. They just sort of stand there. And in some ways that makes the encounters all the more creepy. There are no accounts of these children trying to barge into a home or force their way in. They just keep repeating these things in a monotone voice. And in fact, some people, report that they believe these children are trying to exert some type of hypnosis or mind control. I had a very interesting account given to me by a woman who had used hypnotherapy to stop smoking. And she told me that when she started seeing a therapist, she actually had a hard time going into a hypnotic state. So it took a little bit of time in working with this therapist. And she said that she had developed a very specific feeling that indicated to her that she was going into a hypnotic state. When she encountered a pair of black-eyed children, when they started speaking and repeating these phrases over and over again, she started to feel that. And of course, it set off, her alarm bells. And she said, wait a minute, what's going on here? Made her all the more frightened. And of course, she got away from these children. But she's convinced that they were trying to exert some type of hypnosis on her.
Any reports of these children reacting with animals, cats, dogs?
Oh, yes.
Oh, boy.
There's a very fascinating account that came out of Texas. It's not in the book because it was, I met this gentleman after the book was already published. This fellow, he comes home from the store. He's walking up to his door. He's got a couple of bags of groceries and has, as typical in these accounts, just as he's opening the door, he suddenly realizes there's a child standing on the ground next to his steps. And this fellow, he turns and he looks at this kid who stares up at him right away and says to this fellow, "Is it food time?" this gentleman was so stunned he couldn't even react. He's just sort of standing there looking at this kid, but he's hearing in the background his pit bull that he raised from a puppy, 3 years old, charging through the house, glances into the door and sees that pit bull charging down the hallway. It's solid wood floors, George. When this dog, tearing down the hall, just snarling and barking, almost reaches the door, he puts the brakes on. And it's literally like a Scooby-Doo cartoon. This dog tumbled over itself onto the steps, got up as quick as it could. This dog was now terrified, tail between his legs, head down, whining, running back in the house, getting away from this kid as quickly as he could.
With no reaction from the kid, I bet.
No. The
Nothing.
kid just stood there, stark still, repeated his phrase to this man, "I think it's food time. You should invite me in." The pit bull, George, has never been the same since then. This man raised that dog to be a guard dog. He watched it kill rattlesnakes with its teeth, and he had never seen this dog back down from anything. It was terrified just being in the presence of this kid, and it's permanently altered. The dog is just not the same animal anymore.
David, what do these kids wear when they show up?
Most of the reports say that they're wearing a very drab clothing, in tones that are sort of, muted, dark browns, blacks, grays. Occasionally we hear reports where people will say that the clothing looks old-fashioned. I've heard the term Amish repeated a few times, or handmade, or hand-me-down. Ill-fitting clothing we often hear.
And, do they have hair or are they baldish?
No, they have hair.
They do have hair.
Mm-hmm.
Big eyes, pasty-looking, normal kid size.
But here's something else curious, George. No one has ever reported a cell phone, an iPod, a watch. I mean, face it. You go to any place where
every kid has something.
Exactly. Like they're all wired. They've all got a headset on, or they're texting or something. No, none of these kids have ever been seen with anything like that.
How did this first come about? What were the first early cases about these things?
There's two answers for that. The modern wave of these sightings was sort of instigated in the late 90s. A journalist out of Texas named Brian Bethel posted his encounter with a pair of these black-eyed kids in a parking lot. He posted it on the Internet, and it struck a chord with people. It was the first story, appears to be the first story that was posted on the Internet about these children, and people just really responded to it. Other people started jumping in and saying, "Oh, my gosh, I've seen something like this. This is what happened to me." And it sort of went through waves since then. I got involved really researching it in the early 2000s, and every couple of years it seems there's another spike in the activity until about the last 3 to 4 years, which it just seems to be nonstop. There are more and more of these accounts all the time. Now, when I was researching for the book, I started digging back and found that there are older accounts. There are some pretty amazing accounts that go back. There's an amazing one from 1950, and even earlier accounts that predate the Internet and television and everything else. The trick was that you had to go back and look for these beings under a different guise, because the term black-eyed kid, BEK, black-eyed children, these are the modern phrases we use to describe these beings. What I found when I found older accounts is you had to bear in mind that you needed to look through the cultural lens of the people in the time period as to how they would identify these creatures.
Are there any UFO reports associated with these kids showing up?
Very few.
Okay.
Very, very few. There's a percentage of these accounts that come from people who, claim they are abductees and believe that these children are hybrid beings. I've had people report to me that they've had an encounter with a black-eyed child, and they're convinced that it was their hybrid child because, they've been abducted for off and on for 30 years and so forth. But outside of that small little subset of these accounts, no, there's not other paranormal activity, be it UFOs or hauntings or anything else.
Well, you bring up something interesting. I wonder if they're showing up at the home of the mother or father that may have been the donor, and they didn't know that, of course, or whether they're just randomly picking people. What do you think about that?
That's a very curious possibility. It's very strange to me. As I said before, I always look for patterns. And when I first started collecting these accounts, I was a bit befuddled that there just weren't any clear patterns. There's no commonality in the victims. There's nothing that it's a wide range of ethnic background, religious belief, age, and so forth. But what I did find after a time was that there are a large percentage of people who are encountering these children that work in a position of authority. So I have a lot of accounts from law enforcement officers, military personnel, government employees, and it's very interesting. These are often jobs that are high stress,
sure.
Take an incredible amount of time and commitment, and we have to think about how that applies into these encounters and why those people exactly. Those
that are reporting seeing these black-eyed children, and they leave. Now, you're talking about how some of them vanish, disappear. Do they, like some church people, go door to door, or do they disappear entirely? I mean, have they been known to go to other houses in the neighborhood? In the neighborhood, yeah.
No, actually, the accounts are usually very isolated. It will be a situation where they appear to one particular person in the neighborhood, and that's the only time that this type of encounter is ever reported from that general area.
What about adults? Are there black-eyed adults?
There are. And, when I wrote the book, I focused on the children specifically because there are a lot more of those encounters. When we get into the black-eyed adults, we do find more of those that are, possible hoaxes or other things going on. But there are a growing number of accounts of black-eyed adults that seem to be valid encounters, very strange behaviors. And the other thing that's been happening since the book has come out, I've had an incredible number of reports from people who are witnessing a person who appears completely normal. Sometimes it's someone they've known for, a period of time. They will see the eyes shift to solid black right in front of them.
Shape-shifting.
Yes, you could use that term, although nothing else is changing.
Right.
The facial structure
just
stays the same, everything else, just the eyes turn solid black. And this is something that, in fact, there's a whole chapter on this in my new book, which will be out in a couple of months, and it's very interesting. I'm not sure how it connects to the black-eyed children phenomenon. There's a lot of speculation that other investigators and I have talked about, and the potential that, maybe these children are just learning to blend in to the human world, and it takes time before they can assume that completely correct human form, so to speak.
Well, with David Weatherly, his latest book, The Black-Eyed Children. David, you were earlier talking about vampires and vampirism. How does that connect with these kids?
Let me be clear. I'm not saying that I believe these kids are vampires. I think it's very fascinating to look at this from, sort of a folklore perspective, and we have to look at the correlations and try to understand more about this phenomena. Obviously, when you get back into classic, vampire mythos, one of the things that stands out is a vampire traditionally can't enter a household unless he's invited in. And we find that happening with these children. There are no accounts of them entering a home or a car or anything else uninvited, but they try to get that invitation. This comes up time and time again, and that's classic vampire lore. So is this, this weird smell, this disgusting stench that is associated with black-eyed children a percentage of the time. That's something else we find in traditional vampire lore. a lot of people have forgotten some of these things because, the public has gotten fascinated with the sort of sparkly teenage angst vampires, that are all romance centered, and that's not real vampire lore at all. Originally, these were creatures that were literally something that had crawled out of the grave. They were, dead beings that had reanimated, and I think we have to look at the correlations between that lore and some of the things with the black-eyed children in order to understand possibly what's going on here, because we're looking at some primal fears for people, and I always say you can't really completely understand what's going on in these encounters with these children until you start thinking about the psychological aspect. As adults, we're hardwired to help a child. If a child shows up at your door, George, and says, I need to use your phone or I need some water, you're probably going to do whatever you can to help this child.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
But there's something else going on in these encounters because this child is expressing a need, whether it's to come in for the phone or the bathroom or whatever, and at the same time there's this undercurrent of fear within the person who's encountering this child, and it causes a psychological battle to unfold within this. I hear this time and time again, how confused the person was because they're thinking logically, this is a child, I should help him, but something's wrong. I'm frightened, but it's just a kid. What do I do?
David, has there ever been a case where, let's say, parents come home and they've left their kids there, and the kids have let the black-eyed kids in? And
I've
they are.
I've not heard any cases like that, no.
Okay, we don't want that. Do they normally show up alone or with another child?
They're often by themselves. There are plenty of accounts where there are two of them. More often we see that they're boys, but there are some occasions where there'll be a boy and a girl. And there are a small handful of cases where there are more than two of them. There's a bizarre case from London where they actually multiplied as the gentleman was standing there having this encounter with them.
How are they dressed?
Yeah, there's some variation. Some people say that they're dressed in what they describe as baggy or shabby clothes. It look like they're, not quite the right size. They're not fitting quite right. And we're not talking about, the style that sort of some of the young people wear these days. They're saying, no, the clothes look sort of old-fashioned, but they look like they're not quite the right size. So it's weird. We get into some similarities with the Men in Black encounters, when we go into some of these things, the monotone speech, the lack of understanding of what something common is. There's a really kind of an amusing incident where a woman, heard someone knocking on her door, and they always knock, which is kind of unsettling.
Never the doorbell, huh?
Right, and this particular woman, she was in the middle of trying to finish some particular project, and she just had a couple of things to put in place, and this knocking would not stop. It's just this consistent long knock. And she got frustrated. She threw the stuff down. She rushed to the door. She flung the door open, and before she even recognized who was standing there, said, "Why didn't you use the blankety-blank doorbell?" And pointing to the doorbell, well, here are these kids. And this child looks from her to the doorbell back to her as if he has no concept of what she's talking about. What do you mean doorbell is? And then of course, she has the encounter unfolds, and she realizes these children have black eyes, and she can't get the door shut fast enough at that point.
How would you rate the United States in terms of numbers of reports compared to these other places?
It's pretty high, but I think that is in due part to the fact that the paranormal has sort of become part of pop culture in the last 10 years or so.
That's true.
So people have become a lot more comfortable speaking about, UFO sightings and ghosts and cryptids and things like that. I always joke because, I started investigating this stuff, George, when I was just a teenager in the 70s. And, as I grew up pursuing these things, I could go to a party, and if I mentioned that that's what I did, I was guaranteed a nice quiet evening alone. And, it's sort of the reverse now. If I go to a party and people find out that's what I do, they're lined up out the door because they all have a story to relate. So, there's a level of comfort within these, with these topics that really we haven't seen in a very long time. And it's starting to spread some to other countries. I've been in Europe a lot the last couple of years, and, things are getting a lot more open there, too, in these terms.
Okay, let's go to Richard. Now, Richard is overseas and has to be anonymous, so let's check in with him. Go ahead, Rich. We'll respect your wishes, but you are on with us.
Hi, is this George?
Yes, it is, Rich.
How you doing, George?
Good.
I just got to thinking about these black-eyed children. Where do they come from? Who are they? And my feelings are that it's possible that how we've had alien abductions, especially of females, and they say they impregnate them, and 9 months later they become a baby. Could they possibly be the children that are the mother that's been a hybrid that's been abducted? The mother has been abducted and used for fertilization.
Are these the offspring, David? Possibly.
That's the other possibility. We touched on this briefly earlier. The two most popular theories to explain what these things are either something demonic or some type of alien-human hybrid. And it's hard not to see the comparison. We're talking about physical beings that have pale skin and those big black orbs, very similar to the little gray aliens that are so common in ufology now. And if you think about the possibility of some type of hybrid being, what that would look like, artist conceptions come out pretty close to something that looks like a black-eyed child.
Are the eye sockets bigger on these children?
Some people say that they're slightly bigger. Now, it's interesting because there are some older cases that have started to come to light, and there's a really fascinating one, George, that I recently learned about that occurred in Ain, France in 1974. And, they're now calling this the black-eyed children of Ain, France. And these two gentlemen, it's a beautiful day in late fall, and they decide to go for a drive. They're driving through this little town. They reach the town limit, and the last house in the town, they decide they're going to turn around and head back in the other direction. And when they pull into the courtyard of this house, they see 5 beings that are about 4 feet tall. Now, here's the description. They have long hair. They're wearing what appear to be dresses with multicolored spots on the dresses. They have earthy yellow skin and eyes described as the size of billiard balls that are solid black. Now, these weird figures, 3 of them are sort of off to the side. One of them is standing by the house with both of its hands on the house, as if it's just feeling the side of the house. The 5th figure is in the middle of the courtyard and puts its hand sort of up in the air, almost like a greeting. But what happens, these 2 gentlemen, the passenger has rolled his window down to sort of get a better look as to what's going on, and he regrets it almost immediately because he makes eye contact with this creature. And when he does, he goes into a complete state of fear. I mean, he just feels terrified. And this being sort of waves its arm as if saying, come out of the car. And at this point, these guys are both panicking, and the passenger is yelling, please, get out of here, get out of here. And they drive away as quickly as they can. Now, the interesting follow-up to this is that the 2 gentlemen, they rush into town. When they get back to the village, they get a couple of other people, and they go back to this house to see if these 5 figures are still there, and they're not. They've disappeared. When an investigator showed up several months later to look into the encounter, he found a neighbor that said, oh, yeah, there was really something strange that day because I saw a group of children wearing yellow oilcloths standing in the courtyard of that house. So this is an independent verification that there were some type of strange figures there that day. And this is 1974. So this is well before, the common term black-eyed kid or black-eyed child, and well before the well-known Brian Bethel encounter. What I call the modern wave of these encounters started in '96 with the Brian Bethel encounter. But when I researched the book, I started finding encounters that went much, much further back than that. So, we're finding accounts from the 70s, the 1950s, and even earlier. The trick is when you go back to these earlier accounts, you can't go back and search for black-eyed kid encounters, because that particular term is, what was applied to them after the Bethel encounter. So you have to sort of look through the cultural lens of the time period or the location, and you'll find these same type of entities appearing, but people are calling them, demons or ghosts or a wide variety of things.
It's just a bizarre phenomenon, David. It really is. I'm beginning to think, though, they may be hybrids.
It's a very weird phenomenon, and I tell you, George, even when I was researching it, I would look into different aspects of this thing and think, okay, well, wow, this makes a lot of sense that they're probably, hybrid beings. But then you focus on a different aspect of the encounters, and you think, wow, these things have a lot in common with, demonic entities. Sure, and that's one of the things that really fascinated me about the phenomena, was that it really crosses the line into a wide range of different, paranormal subjects. You can equate them to the Men in Black, the demonic entities, Jinn, hybrids, a whole wide range.
It's all tied together. Great topic, David. I got to tell you, when I met you at a conference years ago, and you had mentioned you were doing this, I went, "This is going to be amazing." I bet you get a lot of responses wherever you go, don't you?
Yeah, I do. It's just a very compelling topic, and people are fascinated to know more about it. And again, because it crosses the lines into so many different areas of the paranormal, you get a wide range of people looking at it and trying to, figure out exactly what's going on here. I'm happy to see that a lot of other researchers are now addressing this, and I hear all the time that someone else is writing a book about it. So eventually, I'm sure there'll be a lot more information out there. And I know that other researchers, consistently get stories and accounts. Dave Schrader still gets a lot of accounts, and Jason Offa, Nick Redfern, a lot of these guys are receiving black-eyed kid encounters, and they're different ones from the ones that people send me. So there are a lot of these accounts out there that still haven't surfaced.
I know you do a lot of stories on this. Are you scared about these?
Actually, no. I certainly don't want them showing up at my door.
No.
But
or playing with kids.
I guess I have a propensity to sort of dive into this stuff after having done it for so many years and pursuing it. I think, to be honest, that the Jinn are more frightening. And
yeah, you come home. Look, Daddy, my new friend. Hi, Mr. Weatherly. I'm here.
The Jinn, is essentially are interpreted through the Middle Eastern lens, so to speak. And, the thing to bear in mind is that Islam has now spread all over the entire world. And, those cultures interpret the Jinn in some places slightly different. For the most part, in the Middle East, people, they won't talk about the Jinn because
they think it's a sin, don't they?
Well, they believe that if you talk about them, it draws their attention, and that it's not attention.
Manifestation again. Here we go.
Right. So, but yet, you go to some areas of Asia, for instance, and you find some fascinating things because some of the folk traditions have blended with Islam over there, and there are some of these groups that attempt to utilize the Jinn. Will intentionally try to bind them into a ring or a knife and things like this in order to access their power.
Do these black-eyed children, do they laugh?
The black-eyed children, they don't really display much emotion. It's, they're always very monotone.
Huh. They don't cry, nothing.
Communicate with people, and they're not really, there's not really those types of encounters with them for the most part.
Do they get mad if you don't let them in?
People perceive that because they tend to get not overtly angry, but they become more insistent. And, they start to demand a little bit. Some people believe that they're attempting to exert mind control, because people have these experiences where they'll feel their hand slipping off the door or pushing it open slowly, as if they're about to comply with the, insistent directive to just let them in. And then something sort of snaps and they realize, oh, what am I doing? I can't let these kids in here. There's actually an account in Strange Intruders about a gentleman who, associated with two people that he knew for a little time. He would go to their home for dinner and so forth, and he was living in Hawaii at the time. And he was having dinner with them one evening, and the experience that he had was sitting across the table from this couple, and all of a sudden just something happened that he said the vibration was just kind of strange. He looked up at them, and their eyes suddenly turned solid black. Now, he had known these people for some time and had never seen anything unusual or anything like this happen. And, he just had this deep sense of dread, and he saw this happen. He said that time sort of froze. He got away from the situation as quickly as he could, and it only lasted for a few seconds or so, but he is absolutely sure of what he saw, and he got away from these people as quickly as he could. They acted very strange when they saw him after that, and he avoided having any close contact with them after that point, but it really altered a lot of things in his life, and some strange things happened to him. He developed a couple of phobias that he had never had before, and there have been a few other accounts where people have had the same experience. They've seen people whose eyes suddenly shift from just a normal human eye to being solid black, and that's a weird connection that I'm honestly not quite sure what to make of it at this point. There's nothing that really relates to it too much in traditional lore. I mean, some demonic cases or cases of possession, people describe things like that. But other than that, it's a really strange variation on these encounters.
Are there similarities beyond just the black eyes with these children? Do the personalities all stay the same?
With the children, some of the commonalities we find are pale or pasty skin. Some people say the skin doesn't even look quite real, like it's artificial. The monotone voice is fairly common. The age range of the children always seems to fall around the same age range. It's pretty typical for them to vanish very suddenly, when the encounter comes to an end. And the insistence is very common. They always insist to come inside, to be invited inside, whether it's a vehicle or a store or a home. More and more of these cases showing up of adults with black eyes. There was quite a case last summer with a couple of associates of mine, J.C. Johnson and Jack Carey from the Crypto Four Corners group, and they were investigating a case in New Mexico, driving in sort of in the middle of nowhere, close to Gallup though, and just out on this road sort of going nowhere towards the reservation, and they see a figure walking on the side of the road. JC and Jack were in the back seat of this car. There was a driver and a passenger in the front. They slowed down. They saw that it was a young woman, and she was walking in the desert, George. She was wearing 6-inch cork heels, and what they described as a tattered one-piece jumpsuit. And they were concerned that something was wrong with this person. So, like the caller, they pulled aside, and JC rolled the window down and said, hey, miss, are you okay? And she turned and looked at them and said, fine, everything I need. And when she turned and looked directly at Jack and JC, they realized her eyes were solid black. So, JC gets very disoriented, and they're immediately telling the driver to, go, travel away. And so similar to some of these other cases, in the aftermath of this, they had some, physical issues, a lot of disorientation. Jack became, feeling very violently ill, almost to the point of vomiting, and a lot of issues with JC felt like he was overheating, and a very strange burning sensation in his head. So again, this is a female adult, the middle of nowhere with solid black eyes. It's just a very bizarre case, and more of these incidents showing up with adults.
Are most of these cases during the daytime or the nighttime?
No, they tend to be more. A lot of the initial cases when I investigated them were, right in the evening, just before sundown. But the more you dig into it, the more you'll find that there are cases at all hours. Of the
so
day
they're not
and
like
night.
little vampire kids or anything.
Yeah, they tended to be a little bit more common in the early evening or the early hours of the morning. So sort of those off times when people are winding down from work, or when people are maybe just getting up or just beforehand. The questions are always different, in the cases I've investigated. They'll say they need to come inside to get a drink of water, or, they just want to stop in for a while. Phrases that don't really make any sense for the location they're visiting because the people don't know them.
It's British ufologist, cryptozoologist Nick Redfern, author of many books on UFOs, cryptozoology, the paranormal conspiracies. Nick writes regularly for magazines, and he has uncovered thousands of pages of classified documents that the Royal Air Force, the Air Ministry, and the Ministry of Defense files on UFOs. And here he is back on Coast to Coast with his latest work, The Black Diary, MIB. That's Men in Black, Women in Black, Black-Eyed Children, and Dangerous Books. I hope your book's not dangerous, Nick.
Well, it may well be, George.
Welcome back. How have you been?
I'm good, thanks. How's it going?
Good. You're all over the country these days, aren't you? My gosh.
Well, I guess it's what I do. I investigate and write and lecture. I like to get the new material out there. A lot of people who are interested in the same things as me. I think it's important, that we get this information out there and share it and, try and figure out what's going on.
Did you go through an evolution yourself? Did you start off, for example, as a ufologist and then you brought in crypto, or was it the other way around? What was your progression?
Well, actually, when I was about 6 years old, my parents took me on a week's vacation to Scotland, and we spent a day at Loch Ness, and my dad told me the story of the Loch Ness Monster, and that's sort of what was my first opening, I guess, to the world of the paranormal. And but yeah, there was, I think when I was sort of about 11 or 12, I definitely was sort of more focused just on UFOs when I started reading books on the paranormal. But then, I sort of expanded a little bit more, and then found in some cases there are even crossovers, between some of these different phenomena as well. So I guess it's like anything in life, the more you look into it, the more you find,
Nick, let's talk about, of course, the brand new book, The Black Diary. Tell me about the title.
Well, basically, George, it's called The Black Diary because it's written in sort of a journal-type style, and it covers about the last 2.5 years, and it's focused on all the various new material that I've got on the Men in Black mystery, the Women in Black, and the Black-Eyed Children. And because it was sort of like a day-by-day saga where I was actually sort of tied into a lot of this weirdness that went on in that particular period. That's why I decided to sort of write it and chronicle it in sort of a diary/journal style. And it's filled with new accounts of the Men in Black, the Women in Black, and a lot of new material on the Black-Eyed Children phenomenon, which is still growing and expanding as well. And for me, I think more than anything else, the most sinister aspect of the whole story is how I kind of got dragged into it as well and started to experience some of the weirdness that the witnesses themselves who'd seen the Men in Black had experienced as well.
What dragged you in on this? How'd that happen?
Well, I've written several previous books on the Men in Black mystery, and I get a lot of feedback. And so a substantial amount of the material came from people who wanted to share their stories, having read some of the previous books. But it wasn't quite that sort of simple. The more that I interviewed these people and investigated their cases, etc., I found that I was becoming sort of part of the story where, for example, some of the witnesses described getting hang-up phone calls in the middle of the night with sort of strange electronic noises, bleeps, and static down the phone. And then I started to experience things like that as well. And it sort of blurred the lines between the witness and the writer to where there was this sort of, like I said, blurring of the lines, and I became part of the phenomenon as well, if you like, and which usually, I sort of stay detached and just write about it, but it was very different on this occasion where, it was difficult to determine who was the investigator and who was the witness, and was it a bit of both?
Yeah, I love it. And I love the title, The Black Diary, but you got this little tiny, what looks like a sticker on the book. It's part of the cover that says, "Warning, just picking up this book invites them in."
Well, some people said, is that just like a gimmick? And it actually isn't. The reason why it has that on the cover of the book is because one of the things that I found, and this is sort of really sort of kind of creepy and disturbing, is that, is that various people who had read books on things like the Men in Black and the Black-Eyed Children, including some of my earlier Men in Black books, they found that when they were reading books on these particular topics, strange phenomena would happen. I interviewed 5 or 6 people for the book who had been reading about the Black-Eyed Children specifically, and they started to experience really weird stuff in the house, like poltergeist activity, significant damage to electrical equipment, which would just sort of blow out, like microwaves, refrigerators, TVs. And they found that it would happen when they were reading about these phenomena. When they weren't, it would go away. And several of the people I interviewed actually felt that just by thinking about these phenomena, it somehow invited them in, so to speak, and as if an alarm bell kind of goes off from their perspective, and then they start to turn the tables on the researchers, on the people reading the books. And I found this on so many occasions where thinking about these phenomena and writing about them really did seem to almost invite them in, so to speak.
Let's break down the Men in Black, Women in Black, Black-Eyed Children as we go through this, Nick, and then we'll take calls next hour with everybody.
Okay.
Men in Black, they have been considered to be government agents, extraterrestrial beings. They seem to have no chemistry at all, no personality. What's your take?
Well, yeah, that's a good point, because I think it's important to note that, certainly for the general public, you mentioned the Men in Black, they think of Will Smith and Tommy Lee Jones. They think of the movie versions of the Men in Black because the movies were so sort of iconic and popular. People assume, even within ufology at times, that the Men in Black are government agents. Now, I don't dispute that on occasion government agents have gone out to interview people about UFO encounters, and back in the 50s and 60s the guys did wear sort of dark suits and fedoras. So a small percentage, I think, do fall into that category, but the overwhelming majority of all the reports, if you look at the witness testimony, they describe something very much different. And by that, I mean they talk about seeing these Men in Black as looking very pale and gaunt, almost like emaciated, and they have these oversized eyes sometimes, which they hide behind wraparound sunglasses. And people, you would imagine late at night, if you get a knock on the door and you look through the spy hole and you see these strange men in black the other side of the door, you certainly wouldn't let them in. But the weird thing is that people do let them in, and with hindsight, they feel as if somehow they were sort of mind-controlled or hypnotized somehow to let them in the house. And this angle of the sort of the hypnosis or the mind control, coupled with how weird and strange they look, has given rise to the idea that they're not entirely human. That are they alien-human hybrids? Are they something paranormal or multidimensional? All we can say for sure is that if you look at the overwhelming majority of all the reports, they honestly do not come across like, they're working for some sort of government agency. It's the story of the Men in Black is far more H.P. Lovecraft than it is the X-Files. It's more like a gothic, nightmarish type story.
Now, what do they generally want, in your opinion? What are they after?
Well, primarily, when you speak to the witnesses, we get this angle where they threaten people and frighten them, terrorize them into not talking about their UFO experiences. But some researchers suspect that may actually be kind of a ruse, and I'll explain what I mean by that. There are a lot of cases where when the men in black and the women in black and the black-eyed kids are in the house of the targeted person, the witness or the victim, they start to feel ill. They start to feel weak.
Mm-hmm. They feel something happens to them, yeah,
as if they've got no energy. And one of the suspicions is that could these entities actually be, if you like, literally draining us of our energy, some like a supernatural parasitic creature that feeds on the human life force and human energy. Now, that sounds controversial, which it certainly is, but there are a lot of people who've reported that where they literally felt they were so weak, they could barely stand up to get to the door, to get away from them. Others felt that they had sort of the shakes, as if they were almost like a diabetic starts to crash, and I have so many cases like that it's difficult to deny that possibility that we're dealing with something that views us almost as fuel or food almost.
Have you ever had any reports of MIBs physically hurting somebody?
Well, that's an interesting question, George, because actually the answer is no. It's the threat is always sort of a verbal threat.
Yeah, there's an undertone there, right?
Oh, yeah, there's definitely an undertone where people very often keep these stories or these encounters with the Men in Black to themselves for not just years, but sometimes for decades, because they're still terrified that they're going to come back and threaten them, or who knows what next time. But although I'm not sort of aware of any literally physical cases of people being harmed, there's no doubt that the inference is there that if you talk about this, something is going to happen. And people do. They listen and they keep this in their mind for years. I mean, for example, in the new book, The Black Diary, I've got several cases of people who'd had experiences with the Men in Black back in the 60s and 70s and did not talk about these experiences till, sort of 3 or 4 years ago. And it specifically was because of the fear and opening the door again to what might be an even more dangerous and threatening experience.
Nick, let's talk about similarities and parallels in terms of the people they visit. Mm-hmm. Are most of the visitations done at a house?
Yeah, they are. Typically what happens, there'll be a knock on the door late at night. It's very rarely that these encounters occur during the day, although some of them do, but the overwhelming majority are at night. There's a knock on the door. And like anybody, if you get a knock on the door at, say, 11 o'clock at night, you're going to think, who on earth's that? People go to the door, they look through the spy hole, they see these creepy trio of men in black or black-eyed kids or women in black standing there, And then that's when things start to get weird, where they clearly, in normal circumstances, none of us would open the door under those circumstances, but they do. People feel as if their mind is not theirs anymore. They can actually, in some cases, the witnesses have seen their hand go into the door and not able to stop themselves from opening it. And then very often there's like this little sudden blur where they remember opening the door, and then the next thing is that they're in the room staring at the person. There's this sort of like a jump sometimes of 4 or 5 seconds, which they cannot recall. And typically one person, or one MIB, I should say, issues the threat. You won't talk about this experience you had. You won't talk about the UFO encounter you had. Forget about the abduction experience. Things like that. And all the time while one of them is sort of dictating what the person will or won't do, the other MIB, or the several, are intensely staring at the witness. And that's when this sort of sense of...
it's almost like they burn their eyes through them or something.
Yeah, exactly. And that's when this sort of angle of the people feeling weak and tired and unable to sort of fight back, that's when that kicks in. And the final stage, which is perhaps the most disturbing one of all, is that in a number of cases, and actually a growing number of cases, when people have been in close proximity to the Men in Black in their home, within days, and in some cases within hours, they've fallen sick with diseases and illnesses, as if in some fashion they've been sort of supernaturally infected. So you put all those angles together, and you're dealing with something that is far beyond, government agents or something like that. It's much more mysterious than that.
Are these diseases curable, or what happens? How long do they linger?
Oh, yeah, I mean, there's some cases I've got where people literally within days went down with sort of very kind of exotic and rare diseases. And other cases, it's like going down with a severe virus and, a raised temperature, but dangerously raised temperature and things like that, which, for the most part, they've all been treatable. But, if it was just 1 or 2 cases where this happened after the encounter, you just put it down to coincidence. But there are a lot of reports like that, so many now, where, there is this parallel between them entering the house and then the person falling sick. And there's also sort of a residual energy. And what I mean by that is that a number of people reported how after the Men in Black have gone, for a day or two, there's sort of a strange atmosphere in the family home, as if there's some sort of residue left behind. And people have described primarily things like poltergeist activity, where something will sort of violently move across the table, a book on a table, things like that. And as if, like I said, as if some essence of the Men in Black has been left behind, and it gradually fades away. But for the first few days, it's sort of present and causing chaos, even though the Men in Black have actually gone.
Let's talk about women in black. Nick, who are they?
Well, George, a lot of people aren't aware of this aspect of the phenomenon, and I think possibly because, as I said at the start of the show, the term Men in Black is sort of so iconic that I think people largely sort of have literally up until now sort of overlooked a lot of these women in black stories, not sort of perceiving a connection. But there actually is a direct connection. For example, they have this sort of same appearance as the Men in Black, where their skin is very pale, and some people have described it as looking plastic-like and doesn't sort of seem fully normal. And like the Men in Black, they wear these large wraparound sunglasses and threaten people not to talk about their UFO encounters. Now, admittedly, there are less reports of the women in black than there are the Men in Black, but that may be that perhaps people just haven't reported them, not realizing, the implications of the event. But I interviewed a number of people for the book who'd had their own women in black experiences. One of them dates only back to July 2012, and this is a woman named Gloria who lived in Decatur, Texas, or still lives in Decatur, Texas. And I interviewed her in 2014, and she told me that how in July 2012, she was sat outside in her backyard and saw this literally sort of like a 1950s-style flying saucer briefly hover over her home, and then it just suddenly shot away. And that, too, was amazing enough. But then the very next afternoon, there was a knock at the front door. When she opened the door, there was a woman stood there in a black business suit. She described it to me as looking very, very skinny and tall, and her skin looked strange, very pale, almost sort of like a mannequin type appearance. And she was wearing what was clearly like a long black wig. Clearly wasn't a pretty good wig either. And the woman said to Gloria something along the lines of, the government doesn't want you not to talk about this or to know about this. And she almost basically sort of invited herself in. And Gloria was actually quite intimidated and frightened by this experience, and sort of really didn't talk about it for a while. It was only when she started to look into the phenomenon a little bit deeper and realized that what she'd actually experienced was something that many other people had experienced. And I live just outside of Dallas, and a return trip or drive to Decatur isn't very far at all. So I was able to speak with Gloria in person, and like so many of the other witnesses, she was still concerned by that experience years later, and she came up with the same question that so many other people also ask me: do you think they're going to come back? And that is one of the sort of overwhelming issues that surfaces in these women in black stories, that people are so fearful of the appearance and the weird nature that they not only don't forget about the experience, they worry if it's going to open the door again if they start sharing the story.
Are the women in black stories relatively new, or do we just not know about them?
For the most part, it's not a new phenomenon, but I think people have overlooked some of the cases. Now, John Keel, for example, when John Keel was doing his research into the Mothman stories at Point Pleasant, West Virginia in 1966 and 67, Keel found a number of cases where Mothman witnesses have been visited and threatened by women in black. And they use the cover story, if you like, that they were working for the government and they were taking a census kind of report, and, the typical kind of things: how many people live in the house, what's the average income, things like that. And then the questions would get weird. Have you had any strange dreams lately? Any paranormal phenomena? And then, of course, the witnesses realized these are not the kind of questions that a census taker would ask. And even Keel himself found himself plunged into this mystery when he got phone calls from sort of angry people in Point Pleasant who said, your secretary has been intimidating us and knocking on the door all hours of the day, demanding information. And Keel had to reply and said, I don't have a secretary. Wow. And when they described the woman to Keel, he realized it was one of these women in black, dressed totally in black, pale skin, vampire-like looking and cadaverous. And so, again, this is an example of how the phenomenon, as I said earlier, turns the tables on the investigator, and they become part of the phenomenon too.
Have the women in black ever appeared with men in black?
That's a good question. They have. There aren't too many cases like that. It's usually either one man or three men or one woman alone. But I have got a couple of cases in the book where it was a man in black and a woman in black. And what was interesting is that in one of those cases, they almost looked like twins. Although one obviously male, one female, but they did look sort of very, very similar, even though, it was a different sex. And in that particular case as well, they were described as having extremely pale skin, no lines on their faces at all. And the witness pointed out that they were looking at people who they couldn't figure out how old they were. Were they sort of 25, 45? They just could not, sort of accurately say how old they were. They just sort of looked almost like ageless. And in these cases with the men in black and a woman in black turning up, what's interesting is that they were specifically abduction cases.
Yes, that's
all
right.
of them. They weren't sort of lights in the sky, anything like that. It was specifically abduction cases. Now, what that means, I actually don't have any clue at all. But, you can find these little interesting parallels and trends that sort of place different cases into different categories when it comes to how the MIB and the women in black deal with these events.
Nick, David Weatherly, of course, brought to us years ago the story of black-eyed children, and they're pretty scary type events when they occur, where these kids are just hanging around, they want in your house, and they've got this look of, black eyes. You can't really see any, any white of their eyes or anything like that. Tell me about your work with them.
Well, one of the reasons why I'm particularly interested in the black-eyed children phenomenon, George, is because there are clear and undeniable parallels between them and the men in black and the women in black. Now, one of them, of course, is the clothing. The men in black wear black suits, black fedora. The women, black business outfits and a long black wig. And black-eyed kids, they usually wear sort of a black hoodie. And even their sort of like their modus operandi, so to speak, is very similar to the men in black as well, where they typically turn up late at night, knock on the door, and they try and find a way to get invited in the home, which is a classic aspect of a lot of these reports of men in black and women in black, and which in some strange ways kind of parallel the old legends of vampires, which have to be invited into your home before they can cross the threshold. And with the women, with the black-eyed kids, their skin is very similar, very pale. But of course, the overriding thing that freaks most of the witnesses out are these solid black eyes that these kids, if they are kids, have. And they constantly try and find ways into the house. We're lost. Can we use the telephone? We're homeless. Can you give us some food? But it all revolves around them trying to find a way inside rather than keep the conversation going on the doorstep. Now, fortunately, most people don't let them in. When they see these sort of black eyes, they just freak out and shut the door. But there have been several reports where they did enter the home, and I talk about these in the book as well. And what's interesting is that in two of these cases, we had exactly the same thing that people reported with the men in black, that when the black-eyed children were in the home and staring at them and just saying things like, food, we need food, they started to feel ill as well. They started to feel weak and tired, as if they were almost, going into like an anesthetic type state, as if they could barely stay awake. They had no energy. They started to get the shakes. And again, so this, creates this image of somehow these entities literally kind of preying on us. And there have been cases as well when they've got in the house or they've been right by the door and the family dog has reacted in a very sort of hostile or in some cases terrified response, as if the dogs can pick up some sort of energy or vibe from them that demonstrates that for the dogs, they're clearly not normal children.
These kids truly come across as being evil, I think.
Oh, well, yeah, that's a good point, because nearly everybody, if not everybody, who sees them gets that kind of creepy, weird vibe from them. And it's like the whole thing is staged, there's no real intent. Can we use the telephone? And, they're clearly not just there for food. the whole thing is like stage managed. It's like a piece of theatre that is played out with the one prime role to get into the home. But it's interesting, that they don't force their way in. They wait to be invited, and if they don't get the invite, there's sort of this frustrated look, and they leave. So,
You hope they leave. You hope they leave.
Yeah, so it's a very kind of a weird phenomenon, which has, as I said, overtones with and parallels with the old vampire legends. And as I said, the very deep similarities between all three categories, men in black, women in black, black-eyed kids in terms of the skin, clothing color, coming out late at night. And also, just like with the men in black, people who've had the black-eyed children in their home, they too talk about this weird vibe, as if some sort of residual negative energy has been left behind. I interviewed David Weatherly for the book because David had some really interesting cases which he shared with me where people have been reading about the black-eyed children and they had started to experience weird electrical problems in the home, which, as I talked earlier about how that happened in relation to the men in black. And those black-eyed children readers, so to speak, also felt that somehow reading about them was inadvertently inviting them into their space as well.
If you don't let them in, what are the dangers? What's the downside later? I mean, do they sneak in, or do they simply leave and go to the next place?
Yeah, that's what it seems to be, George. They sort of just move on. And as I said, for the most part...
Or disappear or something.
Well, actually, disappear is a better word because in most of these cases, of all three categories, when they leave the house, then the person suddenly starts to sort of break out of this almost a hypnotic state that they've been plunged into. They run to the front door, and not only are these the entities gone, but they're gone almost impossibly quickly for normal people. People have sort of raced to the front door and literally almost followed them out, and there's nowhere in sight. Clearly, there was no car there. They sort of ran down the driveway, scanned the street, no one at all. It literally seems in many of these cases that they manifest, which is probably the right word to use, they manifest at the front door and they literally dematerialize at the door. And there are, just sort of on that angle in relation to the men in black, there are some cases where the witnesses have seen them get into like an old 1950s era black car, but then the car suddenly vanishes. And by vanishes, I mean literally vanishes, as if it was almost some kind of almost like a sophisticated hologram or something along those lines. So that angle of them leaving and moving on is very weird because, as I said, it occurs almost impossibly quickly.
The great paranormal investigator and writer back in 1966, John Keel, wrote a story of an encounter with the Grinning Man. Mm-hmm. This is one scary-looking guy, right?
Yeah, well, again, the Grinning Man is sort of like a subcategory of the Men in Black. The Grinning Man, again, for the most part, wears this black suit, white shirt, skinny black tie, sometimes an old-style fedora, but sometimes not. But he has this sort of pale skin, but the thing that really stands out for people is this weird grin that he has on his face.
Constantly, apparently, right?
Yes, and it's almost like frozen, in time, so to speak. His face does not change, but it's not like a friendly, inviting smile. It's sort of the smile that something like an axe murderer would have, something along those lines, like a psychotic, dangerous smile. And the phenomenon really began in the 60s. With an entity actually not too far from Point Pleasant, West Virginia, a character who called himself Indrid Cold, and which sounds like some sort of creepy Charles Dickens novel-type character, but
sure
Indrid Cold was this figure that a number of people reported seeing, and since then there've been more and more reports of this creature called the Grinning Man. I've got several cases in the book of Grinning Man type stories. A family from California, the Maxwell family, who I interviewed, and they told me how they'd had a UFO experience, and they did sort of like a road trip up to San Francisco and back down to LA, and then down to San Diego, and the day after they got home, the daughter happened to open the front door and saw on the other side of the street, and bear in mind, it was sort of blistering temperatures, this skinny guy staring back at her.
You know him as L.A. Marzulli, author, lecturer, filmmaker. He has penned at least 8 books, including the Nephilim trilogy, and received his honorary doctorate for the series from Pacific International University. He has lectured on the subjects of UFOs, the Nephilim, prophetic texts, presenting incredible research at conferences and appearances all over the planet. Here he is back on Coast to Coast, L.A. Marzulli. Hey, L.A., good morning.
Good morning, George. Great to be on. How are you, sir?
Good. I'm looking forward to this. You always bring us incredible stories and information.
Well, try to. Thank you, sir.
So what's new with you? What have you been up to?
Well, I started a new film series called The Watchmen Chronicles, and the reason for this, I just felt, Richard Shaw and I did like 10 series of The Watchers, and I just felt it was time to sort of move away from that, start a series. It's my first actually independent film on my own. I directed it and edited it. And, like you said, I travel all over the country. I see a lot of people. And I came up with the idea because people would come up to me at the table. I'd be selling books and DVDs and talking to people.
Yeah.
People would have experiences, and they start sharing their stories. And I said to myself, my gosh, this is unbelievable. I got to get this on film. And so I grabbed my camera and just started filming people. And the stuff that came across, not only in person, but on my desk and emails and telephone calls, and just absolutely through the roof. Some of this stuff just blew me away. And it's ongoing. We get emails from people constantly telling their stories. It's becoming like a little hub where people just send pictures and videos and stories. What I love about it, George, they have a safe landing place with me. And what I mean by that, so many people are afraid to say anything because of the ridicule, or the shame that goes with it, or what have you, or the disbelief. And the whole point of the film is basically to say that, look, guys, UFOs are real, burgeoning, not going away. We need to start talking about it. We need to rip the covers off the dirty little secret. And one of the most startling aspects of the film, I'm at these conferences, and most of them are Christian conferences. So, like 800 people in the audience. And I go, how many of you have seen a UFO, lights in the sky, an encounter with a being? Give me a show of hands.
And there they go. Right?
Up they go. It's like up as high as 35% at some conferences. And
that's high.
That's really high.
That is high. And it's a good job. And what makes this one so unique from some of the other films out there?
Well, again, it's in their own words. And so everybody that comes on the record has actually had a close encounter. Something has happened to them. I think there's only 2 people in the entire film where it's secondhand information. The only reason why I went with that is the stories were incredible. One of the stories, for instance, is this woman called Jenny Ostergaard. And it's just a little cameo, just typical. And look at her body language when you get the film. Body language is off the charts. She's obviously experienced something that's troubled her. And what she's doing, she's talking about her mother. Now, she has no idea of my research. She has no idea of what 20, 30 years of doing this has uncovered in some of the stories that we've heard. And she tells us this on the record. And her face kind of contorts when she says it. She says, my mother was always troubled. She lived her whole life in fear. She was troubled by something. She would never really tell us what it was. But at certain times, she would sort of reveal a little bit of it, and she would say, these entities came in my room, and they got me, and we went through the window. How did we go through the window? We went through the window. And when she told me that, my jaw dropped, because that's Robert Salas. We've covered this in Watchers. How many times have I heard it? Dr. Jacobs sort of says it tongue-in-cheek when he says that all the abductees come to him say exactly the same thing. Does anyone else report going through the window? And it's what they don't understand is it's hands down. Everybody goes through the window. Now, some people go up through the ceiling too, but most of the time it's through the window or through the door.
What are they bringing? The spirit, the soul, or are they, dematerializing people?
I have no idea, George. Everybody I've talked to that has been taken that way, for instance, Bill, who was taken, came right up through the ceiling. Al, who was taken in his car. Al's sort of the centerpiece of the film. I interview him, and he appears 3 or 4 different times in the film, and his stories are absolutely incredible. But he was taken at one point, and I call this UFO brain fog. He's taken, and he's coming home after work, driving home after work. He's in his car, and he goes by his exit, and he doesn't think about it. He just drives by his exit like, oh, this is normal, and he knows he's about to be switched off. He can feel it. It's happened so many times that he knows. 4 hours later, he awakens in the car. His entire body is vibrating. He's in the most intense white light you've ever seen, and the car is being lowered from the craft on a road miles away from where he left off 4 hours ago. And when the car hits the ground, it starts by itself and begins to drive down this curvy road by itself. Where have we heard that before?
Yeah.
Shirley MacLaine in Peru. I mean, it's kind of stuff, the high strangeness that we're looking at. And, of course, he's completely traumatized by the event, and who wouldn't be? He makes it back to his house. He crawls in the bed in the fetal position and basically cries himself to sleep. Now, that's the horrific part of Al's story. It even there's other parts of the story which are just incredibly unnerving. But there's a happy ending to Al's story, and maybe we can get into that a little bit later.
Do they all have happy endings?
Everybody in the film that comes on the record, whether it's Close Encounters of the First Kind or Fourth Kind, has been able to either stop the abduction, get out of it, basically rebuke first, ask questions later type thing, which is, and I realize some people might be listening going, oh, it's impossible. Nobody can stop these guys. Al stopped his abductions, and I was instrumental in helping to do that. Al stopped his abductions. And at the end, I don't want to, the spoiler alert, I don't want to spill the beans here, but Al goes through the whole movie, and I think we can not only travel with him, but we go, oh, my gosh, this guy's been through the ringer. And at the very end, look at his body language, look at his face, look at the way he it's just a different guy. It's just a different guy. So he has a happy ending, yes.
Why do they all want to stop their abductions? Are they afraid? What's the problem?
Well, the fear is usually through the roof. Everybody that I've talked to, now there is a thing, let me just dissect for here. There's a thing called Stockholm Syndrome. And with all due respect to Whitley Strieber, he's been abducted so many times, the thing has happened so many times that he sort of identifies with his captors. That's called the Stockholm Syndrome. And I'd love to sit down with Whitley sometime and have a heart-to-heart over the thing. In fact, Dr. Roger Lear, the last time I saw him, and you know the story, I'll just say it briefly, but we had taken out the implant in Bill. This is, I think, in Watchers 8. We removed the implant, and that thing had gone, it was like it was cloaked. We couldn't find it for an hour and a half in the operating room with Dr. Matriciani. He's got the ultrasound wand. He's trying to find this thing. It's like it's being cloaked. One prayer changes the atmosphere. And my last conversation with Dr. Lear before he passed away, we were out in the hallway. I said, Roger, I hope you realize what happened in that room. And he looked at me. His eyes got really big. He said, L.A., I now believe is a supernatural component to the UFO phenomenon, and I'm going to tell Whitley. That's the last time I saw Roger alive, and then he passed away. We were down in Peru. We came back, and he passed away several months later. So, look, there seems to be a supernatural component to this thing. Everyone that I've spoken to that has even an encounter of the first kind, there's this visceral feeling. In fact, I went down about 2 or 3 weeks ago and interviewed this woman who lives locally. She's about a half hour from my house, 45 minutes from the house. And she had an encounter of the first kind. She's in her car, and she's got her cell phone, and she sees 3 discs, and they're coming at her, classic discs. And all of a sudden, they morph, they change. and maybe we can get into that a little bit later. What that is there actually?
No, go ahead. You can talk about it now.
Okay, well, it's called metaschismonocyte. There's a Greek word. It says the word is metaschismonocyte. It's the ability to shapeshift, to change into whatever you want to change into, which is incredible. And she sees it with her own eyes. She watches the craft change into orbs of light. One of them goes over the car. At this point, she's completely panicked. There's like this visceral fear which comes over her, and you can hear it in her cell phone video. She's absolutely panicked as she's trying to photograph this thing, and she gets some cell phone footage of it. And she was overcome with fear. This is just one person out of many. Now there are people that get the lights in the sky, that look at the stuff, and they're just, what is that? And they don't get hit with that, but it's an encounter that's far away. It seems the closer you get to an encounter with the craft, with an entity, that's when the visceral, the primal fear comes in. There's one guy called Randy Clark, who's a musician. He comes on the record, and it's no photograph, no video, but you're just watching this guy. He's telling a story, and he's packing up his music equipment like 30 years ago, all right? I think he's in Indiana when this thing happens. And he looks up, and he hears this like buzzing noise, and that kind of distracts him. He's not sure what it is, like electrical generator. And he looks up in the sky, and there's like this cigar-shaped cylinder, and it's broad daylight, and it's maybe like 100 yards above him, and he freaks, and he says it. And again, body language, watch people's faces. I'm a student of this, having interviewed hundreds of people by now, and he gets a little choked up. You can see it, and he's trying to stay calm, but he runs away from the scene as he's telling it. He says this, that fight or flight happens real fast when he says it. And he runs to a neighbor's house because he's freaked out, and he pounds on the door, and his neighbor comes out, and he goes, look. And the neighbor looks at it, but the neighbor starts to run, and he holds him back because the thing, which is probably, he estimated it 40 yards long, something like that.
120 feet, okay.
Something like that. And it's at the end of the road, and it begins to kind of bobble. No noise, no sound. It begins to sort of bobble, and then it takes off. And he says on the record, in his own words, that's the title of the film, in their own words, in Randy's own words, if you weren't watching it, in a blink of an eye, it was gone. And that's what I saw when I was 12 years old. Not a cigar shape, but a silver disc. And when that thing took off straight up into the sky, I mean, it was gone. And like if you weren't looking at it, you'd miss it. It just shot up into the sky and was gone. So those are just some of the accounts of the people that come on the record. Some of them are very short, little staccato-like cameos, like Randy's story probably takes him 2.5 minutes. Others are much more involved, like Al's story.
L.A., what do you think is happening? What's going on? Why the abductions? I mean, we've all had our own theories over the years, making hybrids, experimenting. Yeah. What do you think's happening?
I think, and I agree with Dr. Jacobs in this, I think it's a replacement program. They are creating hybrids, hybrid entities, hybrid beings.
To replace us.
Well, it's different. I don't think it's not replace. Chuck Missler would say Satan is building an army. He's outnumbered 2-1. That's what Chuck Missler would say if he were part of the conversation right now. There's a breeding program going on. It ties back into my research with the Nephilim.
But they need us because they could have been doing this on their own.
They need us to get the genetic material, absolutely.
Yeah.
Without our genetic material, it's interesting. You get a guy like Graham Hancock in his book Supernatural. Read the book. Would love to talk to Graham about it sometime. Never met the guy.
Oh, great guy.
Great guy, right. I've heard him. Great guy, real knowledgeable. And Graham's taking ayahuasca, and he's down in Peru with the shaman taking the ayahuasca. Folks, you don't want to be doing this, trust me. But anyway, he's taking this stuff, and he's popping up into what I call the lower astral, the second heaven. And he's looking around, and to his astonishment, he sees the Greys, what we all know, those little guys, 4 feet with the big heads, the black eyes, and he's astonished. What are they doing here? And at the end of the book, after numerous ayahuasca trips, he states this. Whoever these entities are, they seem to be obsessed with mating with us and creating some sort of a hybrid race. Now, that's where, my research comes into play with 30, 40 years of doing this stuff. This ties back into the Nephilim. These are in my opinion, interdimensional entities, not extraterrestrial ones. You know, George, I'll be presenting on Saturday. I hear the Watchman in Dallas. The conference is sold out. But I have a slide which is from the Hubble telescope, and it shows just how dinky we are in this universe, right? We're just this little speck. But the problem is, get this, the problem is we don't know where we are. Nobody knows where we are. Nobody really knows what this thing really is. How it works, where we are, how we got here, it's all speculation.
It's a hologram. It's a computer simulation. We're not real.
There you go. I mean, we're real, but we're in some kind of holodeck thing. It's very, very strange.
It is strange. L.A., when we come back from the break, I want to talk with you about Roswell because you've got some new information there. Yes. But when we look at all of the things that you've studied here with the Watchmen Chronicles, have you concluded something?
I have. It's based on all that research. I have. I mean, people can look at what I've come up with. I mean, I'm not afraid to say it. We can say it after the break or whatever.
Say it now. Say it now.
Okay. I honestly feel that these entities are interdimensional. I think that they're nefarious. They have a very malevolent agenda. That agenda ties back into the biblical prophetic narrative. I believe this is the coming great deception. It's built on the Darwinian paradigm, which acts as a springboard. Evolutionists like Richard Dawkins will state that he believes that we were seeded here by life. And the reason why the neo-Darwinists are doing this is because they look at the DNA molecular structure and they realize this thing just didn't spring into existence. It had to come from somewhere. So they look out to the stars. But Jacques Vallée, J. Alec Hynek would also state that they believe that these entities were interdimensional, not extraterrestrial. If that's the case, then what's really going on here? What's going on, and why does it mirror so closely the biblical account of a Nephilim, the taking of ovum, the taking of sperm? It ties back into the biblical prophetic narrative. It'll be like the days of Noah when the Son of Man returns. I mean, all these ancient prophetic texts talk about this, and that's why I think it's supernatural, it's spiritual, it's interdimensional.
Is it physical?
Oh, it's absolutely physical. Absolutely physical.
So you think they could be coming from other planetary systems, too?
No, I don't.
You don't?
I think they pop in and out of, I think they're interdimensional. I mean, I don't even know what this so-called universe that we're in really is.
Nobody does, really.
Nobody does, exactly.
I mean, I can't even get a physicist, L.A., to tell me about the Big Bang and really explain it. I mean,
it's conjecture. Nobody knows how that works.
You know, how did it start? Yeah. What happened? Where did it come from? Who jump-started it? What was it before it jump-started?
Right. the mind reels because this stuff is just absolutely outrageously incredible. We don't know where we are. And we go through the illusion of living and life. But these entities manipulate space-time, matter, and energy in ways that defy our physics. You can't go through the window. We both know that. That's impossible, and yet it happens.
I'm George Norrie, somewhere out there on Coast to Coast AM. We'll see you on our next edition. Until then, be safe, everyone.